Have you ever wondered about the lives of Christian nuns under the Ottoman Empire? It's a part of history we don't often hear about, but it's filled with stories of incredible courage and faith in the face of immense hardship. For centuries, many Christian communities lived under Ottoman rule. While there were periods of relative tolerance, there were also times of intense persecution, especially during the empire's decline. Nuns, who dedicated their lives to their faith, were not exempt from this. Monasteries were sometimes stormed, and these devout women faced imprisonment and violence. One powerful example is Saint Philithea of Athens. In the 16th century, she was a noblewoman who became a nun and founded a convent that sheltered vulnerable women. For her faith and charitable work, she was brutally beaten by Ottoman aggressors and ultimately died a martyr. This policy effectively capped the growth of monastic communities in many regions. Another aspect to consider is the social status of Christians. As dhimmis or protected people, they had a second-class legal status compared to Muslims. For instance, their testimony in an Islamic court might not carry the same weight as a Muslim's. This legal vulnerability could leave them exposed to harassment or the seizure of property with little recourse. While outright large-scale persecution of nuns was not a systematic policy for most of the empire's history, individual acts of aggression or hostility from the local population or officials were a constant low-level threat. Nuns, being visibly identifiable members of a minority religion, had to be cautious. Life within the convent walls was a sanctuary from many of these external pressures. Here, women could receive an education, exercise leadership roles, and live a life of spiritual devotion that was otherwise unavailable to them in the wider patriarchal society, both Ottoman and even Christian. For many women, joining a convent was an empowering choice, offering a degree of autonomy and purpose. They were scholars, artists, and administrators, preserving invaluable manuscripts and creating beautiful religious art. However, the convent was not entirely isolated from the outside world. The Ottoman Empire was frequently at war with Christian European powers like the Habsburgs, Venice, or Russia. During these times of conflict, suspicion towards local Christians often spiked. They were sometimes seen as a potential fifth column, sympathetic to the enemy. This could lead to increased scrutiny, restrictions on movement, and a generally more hostile environment. Nuns and their communities would have felt this tension acutely. It's also important to touch upon the later period of the Ottoman Empire, in the 19th and early 20th centuries. This was a time of intense change and turmoil. The rise of nationalism across the Balkans and within the empire's other Christian populations, like the Armenians and Greeks, drastically changed the dynamic. The Ottoman government, feeling its empire crumbling, responded with reforms but also with periods of brutal suppression. Convents were destroyed, their libraries burned, and their lands confiscated. This tragic era saw the near-total destruction of centuries-old Christian communities in Anatolia, and the monastic life that had endured for so long was decimated along with them. It's a dark and painful chapter that stands in stark contrast to the earlier periods of qualified tolerance. So, to summarize, the experience of Christian nuns under the Ottoman Empire wasn't a single story. It was a complex tapestry woven with threads of tolerance and restriction, of protection and vulnerability. For much of the empire's history, the millet system allowed them a protected space to continue their religious life. Though they faced economic and social challenges as a second-class community, they were pillars of their communities, preserving faith and culture against the odds. But this fragile existence was ultimately shattered by the violence and nationalist conflicts that marked the empire's final years. Their story is a powerful reminder of the resilience of faith and the precarious nature of minority existence within large empires. It's a history that deserves to be remembered, not in simple black and white terms, but with all of its nuance and complexity. To understand their situation, we first need to understand the Ottoman millet system. This was a unique framework for governing a multi-ethnic, multi-religious empire. Essentially, non-Muslim communities, known as millets, were granted a degree of autonomy. The Greek Orthodox, Armenian, Apostolic, and other Christian denominations were allowed to manage their own internal affairs, things like marriage, divorce, and inheritance according to their own religious laws. This system was led by their religious leaders, like patriarchs and bishops. So, where did nuns and their convents fit into this? For the most part, monasteries and convents were considered part of the millet's internal religious structure. This meant that, in theory, they were protected. The Ottoman state generally recognized the right of these communities to maintain their religious institutions. As long as the convents and their inhabitants paid their taxes and didn't cause any political trouble, they were usually left to their own devices. This allowed these religious communities to serve as vital centers of Christian life. Convents weren't just places of prayer. They were hubs of culture, education, and charity. Nuns were often the keepers of religious traditions, transcribing sacred texts and preserving ancient liturgical practices. They ran schools, often providing one of the few sources of education for Christian girls. They also operated orphanages, hospitals, and homes for the elderly, providing crucial social services that the state didn't always offer. Their work was essential for the survival and continuity of their community's faith and identity. However, the reality on the ground wasn't always as simple as the legal framework suggested. Life for nuns could be precarious and was heavily influenced by the political climate of the time and the attitudes of local officials. While the Sultan in Istanbul might issue decrees protecting Christian sites, a local governor or pasha might have a different agenda. There were periods of relative peace and tolerance, but there were also times of increased tension and hardship. Economic pressures were a constant reality. Like everyone else, convents were subject to various taxes. The primary one was the jizya, a poll tax levied on non-Muslim adult males. While nuns themselves were exempt, the Christian communities that supported them had to bear this financial burden. On top of that, there were often other property taxes and sometimes unofficial fees demanded by local authorities. Keeping a convent running required constant fundraising and careful management of resources, which often included lands, farms, or artisan workshops that the nuns themselves would work. Another challenge was the legal status of their property. While the millet system allowed them to own property, these rights could be challenged. Disputes over land ownership were common, and navigating the Ottoman legal system could be a complex and sometimes biased process. A convent's survival often depended on having strong connections, both within their own community leadership and with sympathetic Ottoman officials. Furthermore, these women lived in a society with very different social norms. As consecrated women who had chosen a life of celibacy and religious devotion, their lifestyles stood apart. While their own communities revered them, their choice could be misunderstood by the wider society. They often practiced their faith in a quiet, unobtrusive way to avoid drawing unwanted attention. The architecture of many convents from that era reflects this need for security and seclusion, with high walls and discreet entrances. Despite these challenges, what's truly remarkable is the resilience and dedication of these women. They found ways to adapt and persevere. For example, many convents became skilled in specific crafts, like embroidery, weaving, or icon painting. The sale of these goods provided a vital source of income and also helped preserve their cultural heritage. Think of the intricate gold thread embroidery on clerical vestments or the beautiful tapestries that came out of these religious houses. This work wasn't just for money. It was an expression of devotion and a way to contribute to the beauty of their faith. The 19th century brought significant changes across the Ottoman Empire. The Tanzimat reforms were a series of efforts to modernize the state, and this included attempts to create a more common Ottoman citizenship, which in theory meant greater equality for non-Muslims. At the same time, European powers began to take a greater interest in the welfare of Christian minorities, often acting as protectors. This was a double-edged sword for Christian communities, including nuns. On one hand, it brought more international attention and sometimes offered a degree of protection. Western missionaries, both Catholic and Protestant, began establishing their own schools and charitable institutions, sometimes working alongside or in competition with the older, established Orthodox and Apostolic convents. This influx of new ideas and resources could be both helpful and disruptive. On the other hand, this European involvement increased the suspicion of the Ottoman authorities. Christian communities were sometimes seen as being aligned with foreign powers, which could lead to crackdowns and increased scrutiny, especially during times of war or political instability. The late Ottoman period was marked by rising nationalism among various ethnic groups within the empire, which sadly led to widespread conflict and suffering. During these turbulent times, nuns and their convents were as vulnerable as the rest of their communities, and many shared in the tragic fate of their people during the violence of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. In conclusion, the story of Christian nuns in the Ottoman Empire is not a simple one of oppression or of perfect tolerance. It's a complex narrative that lies somewhere in between. They lived within a legal framework that granted them the right to exist, but they faced constant economic, social, and political pressures. They were educators, caregivers, artists, and spiritual leaders who played an indispensable role in preserving their faith and culture through centuries of change. Their lives were a testament to quiet strength, deep faith, and an incredible capacity for adaptation in a world that was often indifferent and sometimes hostile to their existence. Their legacy is a crucial part of the rich, diverse tapestry of the Ottoman world. Thanks so much for watching. If you found this topic interesting, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel for more explorations into hidden corners of history. Let me know in the comments if there are any other topics you'd like to see covered. See you next time.